many people eager to learn about mental health in the context of Islam. I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker, who came all the way from Ottawa for this, so I'm really glad to see that there's a good turnout for her talk. Berak Hussain is the International Students Counselor at the Health and Counseling Services at Carleton University. She has an MA in Psychology and a Master's in Educational Counseling from the University of Ottawa, and has been counseling students for 9 years now. At Health and Counseling Services, she helps students from all sorts of backgrounds through issues ranging from anxiety, depression, stress, cultural shock, identity challenges, suicide, relationship issues, and much more. Berak has participated in many counseling and community-related events, presented on the topic of Islamic counseling to local practitioners over the years, in the hopes of sharing common ideas on how to best support faith-based clients. Berak believes that counseling is her calling, and that her desire to help people is not through the self from a medical point of view, but rather through the soul. With the help of university students, Berak has spearheaded the successful and awesome Serenity Islamic Mental Health Awareness Initiative, and you'll find the booth for this initiative out front in the booth area. This is monthly psychoeducational presentations that led up to Canada's first Muslim Mental Health Conference. It was a 3-day conference in May of 2016. Berak has also created a Facebook forum called The Muslim Counselor to discuss and explore these issues. So without further ado, I want to introduce Berak Hussain. I also just wanted to say briefly that we'll only be taking questions that are written, and so we do have volunteers who will be in the aisles. If you have questions that you'd like to write down, she'll give you a cue card and a pen and you can write them down. This is just to avoid any confusion with the questions. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, salatu wassalam ala ashraf al-mursaleen, Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful, blessings be upon the Prophet and his family. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, ala bi-dhikrillah tatma'inna al-qulub. Verily, in the remembrance of Allah, the hearts find rest. I never forget. So when I discuss mental health, and especially from a spiritual Muslim perspective, this beautiful verse from chapter 13, Ar-Ra'd, the thunder, comes to mind, which expresses guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to attaining inner peace through dhikr, remembrance. This remembrance can be learned and applied through mental health healing from an Islamic perspective and therapy for what we are gathered here today for this conference to learn and to share more knowledge about. So with this in mind, we need to know a little bit more about, what is mental health, who, where, what, when, and why. And so that way you have a better understanding of what this ayah is all about, what this verse is all about when it comes to actual practical application of who are these people, where can I access them, and so forth. So today's presentation objectives, inshallah, by the end of it, hopefully you would have all learned about who the mental health professionals are and where they can be accessed. We'll be looking at addressing what types of mental health resources are available and discussing when mental health resources can be used and why. So the agenda will be about, first, who these professionals are, where they can be accessed, what types of mental health resources are available, when these resources can be useful, and finally, why mental health resources should be accessed. And we'll be exploring more detail in that in terms of what is mental health and how it's applicable from an Islamic perspective from our communities and our culture. So let's begin. By the way, anybody who would like to have access to these slides, you can email me and I'll have that at the end. So don't worry about scrambling to take notes. You can contact me and inshallah I'll send you the slides, no problem. So who are the practitioners when we talk about mental health? So you can see here a whole list of people or professions, and this is according to the workinginmentalhealth.ca resource, which lists the practitioners in Ontario. And as you can see, there's a big list here. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, otherwise I'm going to be for the next 2 hours explaining the 5 W's in accordance to these professions here. But for the purpose of today's presentation, I'll focus on the highlighted ones at the top. So registered psychotherapist, which is what I am, and we're going to take a look at what are the academic credentials for these professionals, the different licensed bodies that they're under, where they could potentially be working at, but also what they do, right? We want to understand, because there's so many differences as you saw, so we want to take a look at what each one actually does in their profession so we have a better understanding in terms of who we can access for whatever struggles we may be experiencing. So a registered psychotherapist, and for the longest time, you heard people use the word therapist, counselor. The actual term now legally in Ontario is a registered psychotherapist or a PR, or no, I mean an RP. And so what this requires academically is somebody to get a master's degree in possibly counseling or a counseling degree, or even in chaplaincy. So the registered body for the registered psychotherapist will have specifics in terms of what they would be looking for. So in the past, anybody could call themselves a therapist, but since 2007 in Ontario, it's a protected name now, and there are ethics and rules and guidelines where if you want to practice psychotherapy, you must register, and that has specific requirements. I'm not going to go through them. I'll give you their name, and you can check them out on their website. So a psychotherapist, what do? They talk through the different concerns and with or without structure. It could be short-term or it could be long-term. In a university setting where I work, where we have over 35,000 students, it's probably small though compared to Toronto, right? But in Carleton, that's pretty big. In Ottawa, we have a few counselors, so we can't possibly do longer-term type of counseling. And so we do more short-term to help in crisis situations and whatnot. So a psychotherapist would help clients overcome a wide range of concerns, and they can range from emotional challenges to situations to more psychiatric challenges. And where can we find psychotherapists? Well, you know one, the universities, right? Colleges. It could be different institutions or centers. And psychotherapists would charge per hour, unless in a university setting, for example, or a service, would cover the cost so that you, the client, wouldn't have to pay for them. The slide's just turned off here. So, in terms of fees covered, like I was saying, a psychotherapist could charge for them, or the centers would cover it. If you have private insurance, then that would cover the cost for it. You can pay up front and then it'd be reimbursed after. So when we take a look at what are the issues that we look at in terms of a one-on-one scenario or a group scenario, these could be some of the challenges or issues that a psychotherapist or a counselor would look through. Thank you. So we'd look at abuse, addictions, bereavement, grief, depression, stress, anxiety. I mean, these are all things that we all experience anyways in our daily lives. It doesn't sound so foreign. Who doesn't experience stress, right? It's a common thing, whether you're a student, a parent, or anybody can experience some kind of stress that could trigger potential illnesses if not taken care of. And so through the medium of a counseling session, you can work through these things, right? So a psychotherapist could potentially use therapy based on cognitive behavioral therapy, which looks at the way people think and behave. Psychoanalytical therapies look at how past experiences and trauma could affect the present. Humanistic therapies tend to focus on self-development and growth, and as Muslims, we tend to connect more with this type of approach when we talk about the self or the nafs, and with all the other wonderful things you heard this morning from our speakers. Art therapies, they use creative ways in expressing, so whether through sand therapy or actual paint or drawing. One of my colleagues, she's no longer with us at Carleton, but she did that for a few years, and students really found that beneficial in terms of being able to express their trauma, their stresses through, an hour-long session of just art therapy, right? Who would have thought that would be effective? But it is. And other therapies include group therapy, so it could be workshops on regulating emotions, or it could be stress, or working on self-exploration, and mindfulness and spiritual religious approaches, of course. So in my role as the International Student Counselor at Carleton University, I do counseling with both local as well as international students, and as you know, there's a huge draw of international students that come to Canada for the services that we have in the degrees. And so when you're bringing in these international students and people of different cultures, you want to also be able to provide services for them so that they can succeed, whether it ranges from cultural adaptation, culture shock, or -40 weather that we have in Ottawa, right? That can really shock you. So just adjusting to a different academic setting as well. Coming from other countries, you're going to have a completely different academic system than you would have here. So you run into these challenges, and so I have the opportunity to work with a variety of clientele using these approaches, but also as a Muslim, I get the opportunity to use spiritual approaches that I've developed myself as a student, researching, but also practicing for the last 9 years. You know, we've seen a huge growth of Islamic counseling, psychotherapy, psychology, ranging from journals and conferences like we have today, mashallah. So this wasn't in existence in the last 10 years on a professional level, but we know it's been in existence the last, 1400 years in our own faith, right? So how did I get the opportunity to work with different clients using these approaches as well? And sometimes students will go refer to each other, oh, there's, counselor, this Muslim counselor, but she speaks Arabic. That's always a delight to be able to speak in your native tongue, especially when you're so far away in another country, right? It's always good to hear that. And so the Registered Psychotherapist, this is the name of the school, so the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario, which was mandated in 2007. So from that time until now, in the last few years, a lot of people have been grandparenting, or students who are getting ready to graduate have been going through the process of making sure that they have this designation. Otherwise, once it's law, you can't practice without that. And basically what you have, when you do have these bodies in place, is to protect the public from the professionals. And there's a whole code of ethics when you're looking at lawyers or medical doctors and social workers as well. They have to be part of the school or a registered body, again, to protect the public. So you guys are all experts now in the registered psychotherapists that do counseling, short-term, long-term. We got that? I don't hear anybody.
Yes.
Somebody started sleeping? All right. So let's take a look now at psychologists, which is probably the most common term that you hear when you talk about psychological issues or challenges, or when somebody's dealing with a mental health issue, who do you go see? Psychologist right away. And we have this thing in my culture, the Middle Eastern culture, and when I was studying psychology, they would always say things, oh, you're going to be as crazy as the people that you'll be treating. And we know that's a very, cultural kind of stereotype that we have, that those of us who study this are going to end up like the people who are being treated. Two misconceptions right there. First, that's not going to happen. And second, the people that we are treating, are they crazy? Right? So we'll take a look at that at the end of the presentation when we look at the reasons why we should access mental health. The psychologists, what do they need? They need a background in psychology, of course. And so they would get a PhD at the doctorate level, and they would do both clinical or experimental. Clinical is where they would be registered to be able to practice and see clients, and experimental is, when you hear all those researchers with results, and what we heard this morning from the presentations, it's people who do experimental psychology and do studies and publish their results. So research is always needed, and I think definitely need more research in our from an Islamic perspective as well, combining both faith and psychology. So psychologists assess behavioral and mental conditions and communicate that through a diagnosis. So looking back at the psychotherapist, we do not have the ability to diagnose. We can assess symptoms, and then we would refer on to a specialist like a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a medical doctor, but we cannot diagnose. Psychologists can. So there's a distinction right there. So they can diagnose neurological disorders, dysfunction, psychotic neurotic personality disorders. However, they cannot prescribe medication. Who do you think can do that?
Psychiatrists.
Right. So we'll get to that in a minute. So there's another distinction.
Not yet.
Not yet. We're getting there to psychiatrists. But something you need to know difference here, psychologists cannot prescribe medication because they are not medical doctors. So the psychologist would also be able to enhance and maintain physical, intellectual, emotional, social, and interpersonal functioning through the sessions that they would do, and they tend to work in community mental health, multidisciplinary teams, or provide consulting services to community mental health providers. They also provide support through mobile crisis support teams and primary health care teams. Now, things with psychologists, they charge. They're quite expensive. The psychotherapist could potentially charge around $150 per hour per session. Psychologists can go up, that or definitely more. So we're cheaper, basically, in terms of cost, right? So that's why you don't see much psychologists at, let's say, at the university level, because they cost so much more to maintain. We'll take a look over at psychiatrists in a second and look at the difference there. So if you have private insurance, it would be great to connect with a psychologist, because a lot of psychologists tend to do group work, individual work, and specializing in different areas as well, similar to what we were taking a look at earlier with the psychotherapist. And of course, they are part of the College of Psychologists of Ontario. I'm specifically focusing on Ontario because that's where we are, but each province would also have their own legislative body as well. So psychological associate, you ever heard of that position? Yes? I guess those of us in the field would be familiar with that, right? So what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychological associate? A psychological associate would have a master's degree, not a PhD. They would also need to accrue 5 years of experience, and then would have to go through a series of exams before they can practice as a clinician. They also provide a variety of services at less cost than a psychologist as well. And so they can do this type of work as well. They are also part of the College of Psychologists of Ontario, and they would work with a registered psychologist. So that would be their direct supervisor. But as you can see, in terms of service, they provide similar services to what a psychologist would, but it would cost less as well. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who's done some medical studies and specializing in psychiatric disorders. So they would have both the medical and the psychological aspects of behavior. They identify and treat medical disorders, including learning disabilities, personality disorders that interfere or affect the thought processes, mood, or behavior. So we're looking at things like obsessive compulsive disorder, or commonly known as OCD, bipolar disorder, severe anxiety, depression, borderline personality disorder, or BPD, and illnesses such as schizophrenia. So what they use tools of diagnosis in psychological and biological theory for interventions. And of course, what can a psychiatrist do? Prescribe medication. You guys can interact. This is an interactive back and forth, for sure. Now, here we go. It turned off here, the screen. Just press it, goes to sleep. All right, so OHIP, the medical insurance coverage here in Ontario, the psychiatrists are paid through there. So this is why psychiatrists are incredibly popular, and which is why it takes 8 to 12 months to see one. So in order to see a counselor like myself, you don't necessarily need a referral unless you want your insurance to coverage, then you would need to have a referral. A psychologist as well would need a referral to have insurance coverage. A psychiatrist would be referred by your medical doctor. And like we were saying, it takes quite a few months before you get to see one because they are covered by OHIP. And they're quite popular, especially when you're looking at severe mental health illnesses. Now, the stereotype with psychiatrists is that they just give you pills to pop and they don't really do much therapy. That's not true. For example, the doctor at our clinic at Carleton University does a wonderful combination of assessment, therapy, as well as medication as well. And so it's very holistic. And we work like that at Carleton University at the health clinic, very holistic, ranging from mental health nurses to therapists to the next person here that we're going to take a look at. So psychiatrists, they are under the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, just like medical doctors. So this other practitioner that I was talking about is called a GP psychotherapist. Why do I have a unicorn there? Because they are as rare as unicorns. They also have, they are basically medical practitioners, family GPs, that have taken courses in mental health. So they're not like a psychiatrist fully doing, residency and specializing in psychiatric disorders, but they do have the ability to assess as well, diagnose, and prescribe medication. So they're the two-in-one. They're the rare unicorns that are so popular and sought after because they're also covered by OHIP, right? Because they're medical practitioners. We have a few in our office, and they're much more functional to have in a university setting where they're covered by OHIP rather than being charged by the hour, right? And they're also, part of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. Finally, the social worker. The social worker would have a Master's of Social Work, or an MSW. You guys heard of that? MSWs? It's not a swear word, it's a social worker. And so with that, what does a social worker do? They assist people using their own community resources to resolve problems and enhance their own and community well-being. They also are part of mainly the community mental health agencies and schools, and that's why you see a lot of in the public school boards, they would hire a social worker, right? So they would go from school to school as needed. Guidance counselors are different, right? A guidance counselor could have a master's in education, but they wouldn't necessarily do the work that a social worker would. They would do more career exploration and helping students and then referring on to a psychologist or a social worker. By the way, I'm giving you hints here with all of these professions that we looked at so far, so when we get into the other 4 W's, you'll be able to answer them. So keep everything that I'm telling you in mind. There's going to be a quiz. So social workers, they work in positions such as case managers, crisis counselor, court support worker, mental health promotion worker, and in operational areas such as management, policy development, and training as well. Cost-wise, they can charge for a psychologist or a counselor, or they could be covered under their institution or centers. And of course, they are under the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. So, you guys know the difference amongst these professionals that we looked at so far? Is it clear? So it varies in degrees in terms of the background of education. It varies in terms of whether they're able to diagnose, prescribe medication. But when we take a look at the actual counseling process, it could be similar in terms of somebody in an office doing the work, listening to somebody and helping them. We'll get into more of that in a bit. So, where can these services be accessed? That shouldn't have popped up there, but because you guys are supposed to tell me. So, hospitals. Where else do you suppose we can access mental health professionals, the ones that we took a look at today? Just shout it out.
Universities.
In universities. Rehab centers. Community health centers, yes. Where else can you access? Private clinics, right? People can open up their own clinic. I'm constantly being asked to open up my own clinic because of the specialty that I do with Muslim or cultural counseling. Sorry, right now I only work with Carleton students. Inshallah in the future. But yeah, private clinics for sure. Where else? Where else can you access these services? Public schools, in terms of if you have a student under the age of 16 who needs to see a social worker or a psychologist. Yeah, so you guys got the idea where you can get them. The private clinics, medical clinics. You can always have a GP psychotherapist in your local medical clinic, or even your own family doctor can do a bit of therapy, because that's usually the first point of contact, right? You go see the doctors. Colleges, universities, schools at all levels, and then you have the community centers, and even chaplaincies and religious centers, right? And that's the point of why we're here today, get to understand from Islamic perspective mental health. There's more and more now, here in Toronto, for example, they have chaplaincies in some of the universities with an imam who has training in psychotherapy from a professional perspective. So usually the first point of contact, other than the medical doctors, is the chefs or the imams in our communities, right? Most of these people do not have the appropriate training. They'll start talking about jinn and sihr and possession and that kind of stuff, which it is a part of their Islamic faith, but sometimes it's so much more deeper than that in terms of the medical perspective. There's biological imbalances in the person, right? There are triggers and situations around us that actually trigger crisis situations where we need to go and access help and not necessarily go just through the spiritual route. But it's interesting to see where now we can access support, right? It's not just going to the doctor. We can get it from somebody, but it has to be somebody who is licensed, who is registered at this point, because there's a liability. You're taking somebody's life in your hand. If somebody comes to you and they're dealing with suicidality, you gotta have the proper training to help, right? And now, mashallah, for example, in Ottawa, through the Muslim Family Services developed, along with myself and the other practitioners in Ottawa, the Muslim Mental Health Network for Professionals. And through that, we're taking a look at how to provide mental health first aid to sheikhs and imams, as well as people in the community, and frontline workers of all sorts who are interested. So this is almost like, first aid, mental health first aid. And I'd recommend if you're interested in doing that. And if somebody comes to you and says, I want to kill myself, like, oh, right, you become in shock. Whereas if you have this training, you're more likely to be able to help and guide that person to get the proper help, because this doesn't qualify you to be a practitioner, right? So what types of mental health resources are available? Can you guys shout out in terms of what we looked at so far? What type? I'll give you a clue in terms of what I mean by that. One example is the medical perspective. What would be other perspectives in terms of types? So medical would be in terms of psychiatric, right? It would mean psychiatric, it would mean seeing a psychologist, or a GP psychotherapist, right? The psychological route, in terms of seeing a psychologist, or getting an assessment in terms of an educational point of view. So a lot of people may have learning disabilities, right? Ranging from attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as what? ADD, ADHD. So you would need to see a psychologist, for example, or a GP psychotherapist who's trained in assessment to get that kind of support. For example, at Carleton University, the first point of contact when I have a student who comes in and says, I can't focus, it goes in and out, I can't focus on what the prof is saying, I look at my work and I can't concentrate. And so this could be a learning challenge or a learning disability. It could be ADD, ADHD. Now, remember what I said as a psychotherapist, I can't assess, so I'll use my team where I refer to the medical doctor, or, for example, using a service on campus such as, we call it the Paul Menton Center for Students with Disabilities. So they would do their initial assessment and then be sent back to the doctor to do an official assessment so that that person, if there is a diagnosis of a learning challenge, disability, they get the right support. Because then you have a lot of people, what happens after this? They're not doing well in school. What happens? Depression sets in, right? Lack of motivation. As international students, can you imagine how much money, their parents' money that they're wasting? And also within our own communities, the kind of cultural pressures that we have to be doctors or engineers or, you're in the wrong field type of thing. So there's a lot of pressure there that can really affect, starting from a learning disability, that can really start triggering a lot of other mental health issues that can affect your ability to reach your full potential. What's another type? The therapeutic individual or group type. And I see a lot of people would be very hesitant to come to a group setting where, oh my God, people are going to know my secrets. When in reality, you are in a setting that could be incredibly supportive because you have people who, let's say if it's a grief group, are grieving like you are, the loss of their loved ones, and are not understanding how to cope. Or people outside don't know that you're dealing with grief or don't know how to give you support. Whereas if you both are in the grieving process and you come to a group that is helping and supporting you, what's going to happen? That understanding that you are both dealing with the same issue can be incredibly supportive and uplifting, right? Crisis situations where people, for example, lots of challenges and problems, let's say family problems at home. When we look at crisis, we also look at political issues that are happening overseas, or war type of problems that, yes, we may have family and friends back home, and so how does that affect the person here? That could trigger crisis situations as well, where people could come and say, that's it, I can't deal with this, or you will hear, I don't want to live anymore. Like we were hearing earlier today when Shelby was talking about that, right? So many situations could happen around you, and that could trigger a stress response that, if not taken care of over time, what happens becomes a mental challenge or mental health issue. So in terms of types, we're looking at long-term and short-term. Short-term, for example, at the university setting where I work, is 6 to 8 sessions, and so we spread them out to provide that to students. People could come in with longer-term issues where they want to see somebody weekly, okay, and for the rest of their lives as a support. A lot of people tend to be lonely as well. They don't have people to talk to, right? And so in a therapeutic relationship, you're telling that person your deepest, darkest secrets, right? There's almost that feeling of camaraderie there. Of course, you know, so we have the schools and the legislation and the school, the body is to protect, right? So because boundaries can be blurred sometimes. So when we look at when mental health resources can be useful, tell me, when do you think they are useful? Yes.
In a crisis situation?
Definitely. What else? When else do you think about wanting to go get mental health support?
Yeah, it sometimes comes back. It sometimes comes back after recovery in the case of relapses.
That's right. So that you want to go back and continue getting support. Absolutely. When else? When else would you need to go get mental health support? Addictions, definitely. So when we take a look at that, first one, crisis, right? When we look at trauma as well, we look at stress. I can tell you the month of October and November at the university, it's for lack of a better word, insane. We call, you know how there's March Madness? During stress time, we call November nonsense. It's like that. SubhanAllah, this year for some reason, the stress began not even at the end of September. We were getting jam-packed 2-3 weeks ahead sessions, because school stress at least, can really trigger people just feeling out of control, right? So definitely people go get mental health support when they're dealing with a lot of stress in their life, and not just school, family problems, children, work, right? Illnesses. There could be some physical illnesses in your life or people that you know that you just can't deal with, say, with just the cancer or, you know, whatever issue that may be happening. So you need also additional supports in the form of a group, a support group, or a counselor. When you have a psychotic breakdown as well, you know, you come in to see, you go to the emergency ward at the hospital, for example, or to see your medical doctor, then you're referred on to see a psychiatrist to get support with that. When you have suicidal thoughts, right? And these happen. You know, people can have lots of triggers in their life that can trigger these type of thoughts. Unfortunately, we've had a lot in our Muslim community in the last few years where people have taken their lives because they feel hopeless. They feel nobody's going to understand them or provide support to them. And there's a lot of shame involved as well, right? So life changes, moving, for example, or different relationships, ending or beginning. I mean, you know, the beginning of a marriage can be very stressful, no matter, you know, with wedding preparations, when you finally live with somebody, there could be lots of challenges, and when you may need to get some counseling, couples counseling, which is probably the most dreaded thing in our communities. We don't talk about our problems, nobody needs to know, but then, you know, a few months later you hear them breaking up, whereas a few months before you saw them happily on Facebook with all these, you know, lovey-dovey. So don't believe what you see on social media, which can also be a huge stressor as well, right? Deaths as well, like we were talking about earlier, in terms of life changes, war, politics, and then with the influx of refugees that we've had in our country the last year or so, you can see the huge impact of stress on refugees, and I believe there's a workshop later on today about that, so I'm not going to get into that. Identity. This is a big one. So when we look at identity in terms of cultural, religious, big one I see also students or clients feeling, you know, Muslims labeled as terrorists. These are realities that we've had to explore and be targeted at, and the last few years it's become exponential, right? And also when we take a look at identity when it comes to homosexuality as well, this is something that it's also been happening in our community, and the the issue is we don't know how to talk about these things, how to address, how to support, and as you heard the doctor this morning talk about it, she had made an excellent point in terms of we don't judge the person, but it's rather the behavior, right? So all of these have a huge impact on our identity as, let's say, working women and the challenges that we have and expectations of working and not working, home, husband responsibilities, right? Or the man having responsibility of providing, working, and wife not, respecting or giving due credit. So there's so many different issues that we have in our community. We don't realize that coming to a counseling session with somebody that is ethically not allowed to talk about it, it's confidential, right? Where we can get some perspective. And especially, let's say, if you have somebody who uses the language that we use and uses the same faith, it goes a long way in balancing, creating that balance in your life and helping you. Generational issues, when we talk about identity, the older generation and the younger generation, and the cross generational issues right there, or our parents are not understanding, or we are not understanding of our parents and their views, because they picked up and they came here. They had to go through that integration and culture shock and holding tightly onto the culture and the religion, right? But then we grow up with double identities. I always felt that I had a double identity going to high school. And I had this image in my mind that always strikes out at me when I think of identity, generational and as a Muslim, is during the day, at one time in high school, they had the air bands. You guys remember those, where they do those musical shows on stage? SubhanAllah, that same night at that school, they had a Muslim event that the community had rented out, the same auditorium where they were dancing and writing on stage earlier in the day, which I did not attend, by the way, but I knew it was happening. But it was interesting to see that, and so here's my double identity. During the day I'm this Muslim hijabi in high school, and then in the evening, integrating within, my classroom and people, and this is what's happening at school, and at night, different part of the identity. So a lot of us struggle through that, and a lot of young women, let's say, struggle with their hijab, their identity of the hijab. Do they take it off? So they can integrate? What does it mean to wear hijab? And all of these issues. And these are some of the issues that I see in session when people come to talk about it, right? And so yes, we talk to our aunties, we talk to some of our friends, but people still tend to keep it quiet because they're so afraid of the shame, they're so afraid of what people are going to think about them. Whereas if you come to a counselor, you're going to get a third-party objective view in terms of how to deal and cope with all of these challenges. Does this make sense? I see a lot of nodding, which means that you kind of agree, you've been through it, you know how people have experienced these, or you've probably even been through them yourselves, or you've seen it with friends and family around you, right? And number 5, why mental health resources should be accessed. I want to hear you guys, shout it out. Why should they be accessed? With everything that we've discussed so far, why should these resources be accessed? Shout it out.
Stop the stigma.
Definitely. What else?
Safety.
Safety. What else?
Acceptance.
Acceptance. Wonderful. What else?
They're useful.
Useful. Plain and simple. It's useful, right? Who doesn't want to have somebody listen to them and listen to their problems and give them perspective? And being heard. Being heard in a society where it's all about the digital and not really connecting at the human level. How powerful is it to actually have somebody in front of you who's paid to care about you for about an hour? No, people like me genuinely care about what we do, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. The burnout rate for this kind of work is 2-3 years, especially if you're working in addictions and crisis. So people who are in this field, because we love to do what we do and we care about people and humanity, we want people to reach their full, absolute potential. And this is what counseling can do. So why mental health resources? To help process changes in life and issues and some of the other things that we mentioned. To get back to functioning at the baseline level. What does that mean? So if you're off track, you've had a breakdown, you've had a breakup, somebody's died, you failed an exam, what else? Anything, any trigger, any stressor in your life, talking to somebody can help you get back on track. To work through trauma or crisis or life struggle and change, right? Self-growth, one of my favorite types of counseling. Love people who want to work on bettering themselves through the nafs, through the self, right? Spiritual growth, one of my favorite type of counseling I like to do, but this is more long-term and it's kind of limited in a university type of setting. Support, like we were saying, it's useful, so to get through challenges and whatnot. And I see a lot of people who are lonely, whether it's international students or Canadians from different cities, and whatnot. People are very lonely. Again, this digital, social, internet type of world. You'd think it would connect people. It does, through wires, right, and fiber optics, but face-to-face, what happened to that? And so coming to a counseling session can be really helpful there. I'm going to speed things up a little bit now in terms of why we should access help. Okay, so these are the deeper questions now I'd like you to really think about. Why do we avoid counseling? It comes around what we said earlier, stigma, fear, people finding out. There's shame and weakness, right, in asking for help. In fact, it takes great strength to ask for help. There's no shame in that, right? People of low faith, let's say. I have a lot of people coming in, I want to be a better Muslim, I want to stop drinking, partying around and all. I'm like, well, I can't really give you the formula for that, but we can definitely work through, right? So stigma, again, around these kind of concepts. So I find it interesting that even people who are struggling with mental health illnesses, they don't seek help, even though they're probably ones that need it the most. Why do you think that is? Again, people would rather deal with it than show weakness, right? And expose their family secrets and whatnot. Or denial of the illness. We see it. We see somebody is suffering from depression and anxiety, for example. We see it as a family of friends or colleagues. They refuse. Or an abusive partner, right? Who refuses, because of their depression or anxiety, whatever, whether it's a male or female, abuse exists on both men and women, huh? They deny what's happening. Or addictions. So my third question is counseling only for people who are affected with mental health illnesses? I see a lot of no's. Correct. Absolutely. Again, we were saying it's for anybody who would like to talk to somebody, work through struggles, any of these kinds of things. So what is mental health? We talked about the practitioners, the who, the when, the why. What is it? What is it? In Arabic, it's al-sahha al-nafsiyya. A lot of people, when you translate the language to a language that's understood, they're like, oh yeah, I get that. That makes sense. Just like there's a physical health, there's the mental health, right? Spiritual. And so this definition here by the Canadian Mental Health Association of Canada, mental health means striking a balance in all aspects of your life, social, physical, spiritual, economic, and mental. That makes sense, right? This is something we can all relate to on all levels. Now, in terms of what is mental health, in terms of misconceptions, the barriers, I think we looked through most of them in terms of fear, shame, that people say, oh, they don't affect me. Mental illnesses are not real illnesses. But let's take a look at diabetes and cardiovascular illnesses. Do you not go to a doctor when you're struggling with that? Do you not get treatment in terms of the form of medication and lifestyle changes? Exact same thing when it comes to mental health. However, we don't look at it that way. We look at it as something fearful, something shameful, and whatnot. So in terms of what is counseling, I think after what we took a look at through the different professions today, I think you have a good idea of what it is, right? So the technical definition from the dictionary, Merriam-Webster says, that professional guidance of the individual by utilizing psychological methods, especially in collecting case history data using various techniques in personal interview and testing interests and aptitudes. Very technical, isn't it? Scary. This is my definition, the BH definition of counseling. A confidential, safe, open space for you to talk about whatever it is that you bring here. To help you reach your goals, solve your problems, or provide you the tools to help you cope with the challenges that you're dealing with. There's no judgment. Absolutely. I can't tell you how many times I have people who walk in, they see the hijab, and they're Muslims, right? And they freak out. Why do you suppose that is? They're afraid of judgment. And I tell them, who am I to judge? Have I not sinned like you? Have I not made mistakes like you? I am a human like you and I make mistakes. He's ultimately the judge, or not us. So please leave that out the door. I'm here to support you, not to judge you. And of course, we do the short term and long term, and like we were talking about earlier, the variety of topics that counseling can entail are stress, anxiety, depression, relationships, school, family, the list goes on. And if it's something that I can help somebody with, especially if it comes at the level of the medical level or anything like that, we all have our limits and limitations within the scope of our profession, but also as how we practice, because some of us could be more specialized than others. Like, for example, all the Muslims or people of different cultural backgrounds, they tend to be sent to me. Or sometimes what's funny is that you'll have the international student coming from the Emirates who would come, and he's been struggling with addictions, marijuana, and depressed, just not going to class, really struggling, and they come and see me again. The judgment, the fear is there. But then once we start chatting and let's say in the same language, and we joke around, we talk about politics or whatever, we relax, and then we get into actually action planning in terms of, all right, let's use these supports on campus, this service here, change your lifestyle, learn how to eat. Pizza is not a healthy diet. If you live on campus, the students tend to do that. But what's interesting is I find that, especially the males, they will then seek out the other students on campus and send them over. So that's pretty interesting. So I'd like to end off with this beautiful quote to conclude the presentation of knowledge in mental health by Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, who says, "Knowledge gives life to the soul." And I hope with the newfound knowledge of the 5 W's we explored today, that you'll be more open and ready to give life back to your soul by seeking the proper help for the mental health challenges that are in your life. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Are there any questions that you have written? Okay, I'll read it out. Thank you. It says, when there is denial of an issue, how do you convince the individual to seek help? Is there anything more than just talking to the person? Good question. So when someone's in denial, you know it, I know it, everybody else knows it. It walks like a duck, it looks like a duck. It's a duck. But how do you convince the goose that he's not a duck? Right? Or vice versa. There's the example of the grandsons of the Prophet one day where they saw an older gentleman doing wudu, okay? The cleansing for the prayer. These are young children at the time, they were young, and this is an older gentleman who was doing the wudu incorrectly. So, what did these young boys do? Did they point out to the older gentleman that what he was doing was wrong? Because that would show what? From what we've spoken about today, it would show shame, right? It would show embarrassment, that this older man should know better. So what did they do? Which is a beautiful example. They took the wudu in front of the older man without making it obvious that they were doing that. The older man was watching them, and so he saw how it was done properly by the grandsons of the Prophet, who would obviously know how to do it correctly. He saw his mistake with no words or embarrassment or shame shown. So from this example or the metaphor, you can show somebody in terms of the denial. Perhaps you can project it onto yourself or give examples of other people. I mean, it doesn't help to badger the person. You are crazy, you need to go see a psychiatrist. What is this person going to tell you? You're the one who's crazy, you're the one who knows you need to go get help. There's nothing wrong with me, I'm perfect. But we all know that's not true, they need help. So you can show by example by talking about other people. You can sit down and have an intervention. You know how they do that for addictions? That's something that can also be done. You bring a group of people that this person might listen to, hopefully will listen to, and you can do an intervention like that to help them. And so is there anything more than just talking to the person? You may not need to talk to the person, but it can be shown through that. You can take them to different events perhaps, like say, hey, there's this great conference happening at the University of Toronto. Why don't we go check it out? You know, it's like really cool Islamic conference, but psychology, mental health. You know, and then you bring them here. One time I was giving a lecture on what is mental health in the Muslim community, from an Islamic perspective, and one of the audience members came up to me and privately said, okay, so my brother is deeply depressed, but he won't listen, he's in denial. We brought him along to this event so he can hear and listen to the lived experience of the people and myself as a practitioner from a Muslim perspective. Now, I don't know what happened afterwards, but this is also another way of how you can get people to listen, because when they hear the narrative, the stories, all the things that we can connect and understand, because we have so many similarities when it comes to stressors in our lives, that we can connect at that level, that person will say, you know what? I don't need that much. I don't take care of myself. I don't get up in the morning. Maybe I am dealing with depression. And so when they come to a workshop like this, then they know what they could do. And if they come to you, don't say, I knew it. I knew you. No. Be there. Listen. Support them. Take them where they need to go. Just don't push. Unless they're suicidal, then you take them to the emergency, of course, at the hospital. Does that answer the question? Yeah? Well, I'm going to be here for the rest of the day, inshallah, including for the evening part of our program. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. And also, the Serenity Islamic Mental Health Awareness Group that we have out in the lobby. This is an initiative in Ottawa that we did exactly for the reason that this conference is happening here today, so we can bring people from our community up to speed in terms of what is happening, the problems in our communities, and to discuss it. So follow us also on Facebook, the Serenity Islamic Mental Health Awareness. We have lots of activities happening in Ottawa, including a conference coming up in the spring, and also some wonderful initiatives that are happening. And just encourage each other to be open and loving. Thank you very much. Blessings to you.
So I just want to say that the next sessions are starting momentarily in the other rooms. The session that will be in this room is a really exciting one. It's the National Mental Health Model for the Aga Khan Health Board. So the Ismaili Muslims actually have a great model for mental health that already exists in their community, and I think it's something that our community could learn a lot from. So we actually have one of the heads of the Lee Cushing Research Institute, Dr. Mohammed Mamdani, who will be presenting with a psychiatry resident on this very interesting topic. So I hope you guys stick around for it.